Okay, yeah, so my name's Tom. I am an artist and a writer. I try and make sort of DIY publications and projects and fake organisations. And I do it to try and help people talk about how they feel about the places that are around them and change how they feel about the places that are around them. And these days to try and experiment with different ways of living in the places that are around them. And this is actually going to be quite a weird talk for me because this is all work that I did over the period of about 10 years, and it's all about cities. And actually now, today, if I were to go and give a talk somewhere else, I probably wouldn't talk about some of these projects, because my work often now is about the miserable, bitter world we're creating for our children, and the climate emergency, and how hilarious and sad and tragic it is that we're not doing anything about it. But so in a way, I'm going to present projects today that I don't necessarily love anymore. And some of them are about 10 years old, some of them are from a time before I knew how to use Photoshop. So be gentle. But also I think it's really important to be honest and say like why they didn't work and what is wrong with them and what I've learned from them. And so as I said, I spent 10 years sort of chipping away at the edges of this thing called urban regeneration, urban development, placemaking, call it whatever you want. Even what you call it is actually quite an interesting topic, but we won't even go there. And I was trying to answer this very simple question of how do you have ideas for cities? What do you do with them? How can you make your ideas and the ideas of people around you become a reality? And how can you change the place you live in? And at the start, I was doing that in a very DIY way from the bottom up. And sometimes it's about critiquing that and criticising the way other people are doing it. And then more recently, I was trying to do it from inside the system and using the machinery of regeneration for good instead of evil. Because it's important to say that it is evil. A lot of it is evil. Or if it's not evil, then it is profit-making and driven by making money and not necessarily in the interests of your place or your city or your people. And then finally, we'll get to the end of the talk. At that end of the talk, the realization, the sort of creeping realization that ideas are not enough, and that actually, if you want to look at doing your ideas in cities, not just ideas in general, but making your ideas happen, then you need to think about money and power and infrastructure, and look at alternative ways of doing those things. I wasn't sure about the title. Obviously, I like it from the sort of Sheryl Crow, James Bond type vibe. Is it too depressing? I don't think it is. I think actually there's a lot of empowering stuff in this realization too. So this is going to be a positive talk. That is a Tom James guarantee. Lord knows I could talk a lot about Sheffield. So here we go. In 2004, way back when, before the internet, me and this other guy called Tom Keeley, I set up a fanzine about Sheffield. So this was at a time when Sheffield's regeneration, the current period of it was just about starting. They were just knocking down all the sort of 70s office buildings in the city, and you had this glorious 6 months, the glorious 6 months of potential where you're like, oh my God, they could actually do it. They could actually make Sheffield amazing. I'd been in Sheffield for about 4 years since this point. I came here to study in university. And what was really interesting was that I was starting to feel all these things about Sheffield, about why it was special, about how beautiful it was. I fell really hard in love with Sheffield. But I didn't see anybody else talking about it in those ways, particularly in terms of the council and even the architecture schools. You know, there wasn't anyone talking about how the brutalist buildings at the time, or the beautiful views from the hills, or how the terraces looked, or how the city felt, or the music it made. And we suddenly realised, very, very quickly realised that the buildings they were going to build in Sheffield, that the master plan was bars and shops and offices. And they were like, guys, bars and shops and offices, we've cracked it. And that was as far as it went. That was as far as the ambition went at the time, was some bars and some shops and some offices. And I'm not sure who was in Sheffield then, but I vividly remember when they built this beautiful winter garden, and it was just this crystal palace in the middle of the city, and I was like, oh my God. And then they announced they were going to build a hotel in front of it so you couldn't see it. So it's that brilliant thing of like, oh no, sorry, back as you were. And so you see the short end of it now. You can't see the full beauty of this crystal palace, and that's when you suddenly realised that maybe this wasn't going to go quite as I wanted it to go. So I set up this fanzine, and the fanzine was basically a place to talk about why Sheffield was and is amazing, in the language and the words we wanted to use, and also then to have a place for ideas to make it even better and ideas to build on what was great about it. So we did an issue about, the first issue was top left, and that was like the call to arms, just saying all the things I basically just said. An issue about modernist architecture and how it needed to be preserved, not demolished. An issue about culture and graffiti. An issue about Park Hill. An issue about being gay in the city. An issue about how beautiful Sheffield is. An issue about using dead factories. And an issue about leaving. And what was really interesting in terms of like this city of ideas was that we were very naive. We thought that it was just enough to have some great ideas about some factories. This is what could happen in this factory. This is what you could do in this, get some artists into all the empty spaces on the moor at the time. Turn the floor of Park Hill into an art gallery, that's happening. Light up the graffiti and neon, that happened. But it was a product of naivety. We thought that just having the ideas and putting them in a publication, the council were going to turn around and be like, great ideas, lads, we'll do them. Thank you for having the ideas for us. So I think that the beauty of this is that we did it ourselves. We produced 500 copies, we did it on photocopiers and distributed it for free around the city. And the gay issue is the first time we learned to use spot colours, which is very exciting. But until then, it had been black and white. But yeah, so I think it did manage to conjure something into existence. I think it did, I hope it did, help to change the way that Sheffield thought about itself. But I don't think it had any physical impact on the city, which is really interesting. So, lesson number 1 is, no one will do your ideas for you. The biggest idea that came out of Go, which we did and tried to make happen, was the cooling towers. So there were these beautiful cooling towers on the edge of the city. I don't know, a gazillion people every day went past them on the M1, and they seemed to represent to me everything that was amazing about Sheffield, in that they were brutal and industrial and poetic and beautiful, but also empty and moribund and disused, and nothing was happening to them. And we thought, in a very sort of simple way, if you could reuse them, if you could reclaim them and turn them into a space for things to happen, that would be a great new icon for Sheffield. So it started with an issue of our fanzine, which was a poster, and this was basically a call to arms. We wanted everyone to come up with ideas, and we had very, very madcap and interesting ideas, like a museum about David Blunkett, and someone turning them into a pair of taps and turning them into a sort of a skate park inside. We put all these ideas for show on an exhibition in this pub in the Les Car in Shire Vale. And then we sort of thought that was enough, and we then heard about this Channel 4 competition called the Big Art Project, where they wanted people to nominate sites for public art across the country. So we nominated the Cooling Towers, and we got lots of other people to nominate the Cooling Towers, and we won a place on this project. And thus begun this sort of like media whirlwind, where we getting our photograph taken in front of the towers, looking more and more like Echo and the Bunnymen. I'd like to point out Tom Keeley's hair here, which was of the moment, like a side character in our story throughout, and it went massive. We were in The Guardian, on BBC Radio 4, in The Times. We were part of at the same time Jeremy Till was doing the Venice Biennale about Sheffield, about the Architecture Biennale about Sheffield, and made models of the towers for that. The reporting, I shan't talk about that. It was amazing. It was really, really exciting. But unfortunately, the owners of the towers hated it and hated us. And they wanted to knock them down. They wanted to build a wood chip burning power station there. And we couldn't understand, we can never really understand why they didn't get the idea of, it's not difficult. Tate Modern for the North, we were talking about. It's pretty easy to understand. Of just the idea of doing something public, some sort of public art inside these towers and making them into these spaces for something beautiful. But throughout, they were basically against it. And what was really interesting was that we left the planning. So Channel 4 were like, don't worry, lads, we will do the planning. We're going to get Anish Kapoor to do a temporary work of art in here. It'll convince the Eon. Everyone will love it, and we'll do it that way. So we were like, that sounds really good. We left the planning of what we were going to actually do to these towers to them. And they didn't do it. And we, a fleet-footed fanzine in Sheffield, were outmanoeuvred by a German multinational power company who then offered Sheffield City Council £500,000 for a replacement work of art instead of these towers if they would consent to them being knocked down, which they did. So here's us in The Guardian, crushing disappointment. I like the title. And that was, that was quite a sort of grinding process in terms of ideas. And I think the lesson there, just quickly, so to respond to this sort of disaster, we decided to create a gift shop to celebrate the Cooling Towers as icons as they were at that point. So the sort of thing you'd find in the Barbican, all of the stuff you'd find for the Angel of not the Barbican, the Baltic in Newcastle, all of the stuff you'd find for the Angel of the North, all of those sort of gifts. We commissioned different artists and architects to make them. These towers were made by an architect called Paul Bauer, who is great, and in Manchester, and probably to this day the most beautiful thing I've commissioned. And we had this gift shop. We had all the plates that people would always need plates. We did plates, we did T-shirts, we did tea towels. And we got on Calendar, big shout out on Calendar, and we got in the Observer, and because this gift shop was going to be there for 2 weeks only in the Millennium Galleries, a sort of once it's gone type event where people could come and celebrate the towers as icons as they were. And there was a queue, about a 4-hour queue when we opened up on the Saturday morning. We were sold out completely by lunchtime, and it was pretty mad, to be honest. But and in the end this happened, and we kept saying this quote, "There's nothing as powerful as an idea whose time has come." That's a quote by Victor Hugo about the French Revolution. We thought, yeah, that's applicable to the Cooling Towers in Sheffield. But it turns out there was something more powerful, an idea whose time has come, and that is a German multinational power company. So they blew them up. But the lesson here is have a concrete plan. You need the money, you need ownership, you need to prove that you can do it. I did another project in Sheffield, which I haven't got time to talk about today, with my good friend John Cannon, who's over here. But around the same time, basically, we were extremely poor. And some other people called space makers seemed to have cracked it. And I got to the point where I was doing projects in Sheffield and trying to scrape a living here. And the city council hated me. They really hated me. Like, I was told there was a magazine called Made, which was really glossy. And Sean Bloodworth, who's a really lovely photographer who's sadly dead, he was asked to recommend people to put in this magazine, and he recommended me, and they were like, nope, we're not talking about him. So I couldn't do it. I was in this city trying to suggest all these big ideas and not getting anywhere. And these guys, space makers, were set up by a friend of mine called Dugald Hind. And they were doing the stuff that I was doing in Sheffield, and John and I were doing, inside the machine. They were being asked to do it by councils, and they were getting paid for it. And I was like, God, these guys have made it. And they sent me an email saying, like, would I come and talk to them? And so in 2011, I did that. And I ended up joining Space Makers. And by that point, I'd sort of been talking about Sheffield for 6 years, and I was sick to death of the sound of my own voice. So it was a good time to leave. The first project Space Makers did, now this was before I got involved, it's important to say, but I just want to talk about this in terms of this now coming inside the machine, was Brixton Village. So in 2009, after the credit crunch, there were all these empty shops across the country, of course. Space Makers was set up by Dugald as a space to talk about what to do with all these empty properties. And at first it was just a talking shop. And then Lambeth Council got in touch with Dugald and said, we've got this massive problem in Brixton, in South London, because there's this semi-derelict market. So this is called the Granville Arcade. This was in the 60s, all these are all sort of British Pathé images. By 2009, 2/3 of the market was empty. There's no actual photos of the market being empty. The owners wanted to knock it down and build a big Marks and Spencers, which is, again, that's what regeneration actually means in real life for most people. But the community loved the building and listed it, and Dugald was brought in to mediate between those two people, and Space Makers brought in to mediate between those two people. So they proposed a year-long project of giving all the keys to the empty units to whoever had a good enough idea for free for 3 months. And it was basically the biggest sort of empty shops project of its time, and there were lots of these sort of empty shop projects at the time. Within a few months, it was thriving, and now it's full for the first time in 30 years. By the end of the project in 2010, it was full for the first time in 30 years. And it's a really interesting project because culturally it is massive. It's totally changed Brixton. And whether it's changed it for the good or not is really contentious. once the social uses that were so in that period where they had people doing projects for in 3 months that were completely free for the space, they had lots of people doing social projects as well, like setting up art galleries, setting up rehearsal rooms, setting up exhibition spaces. But when the project ran out, all those spaces stopped, and so from that point on, it was just the commercial uses like shops and bars. And crucially, there were suddenly lots of white people in Brixton, in these places, lots of middle-class people, lots of men with moustaches. And at the time, that's what people had. And suddenly, all the tropes of gentrification were there. So it's really easy now to caricature Brixton Village as just a classic example of gentrification. You've got lots of shops now that look like this. This one is unfortunately called Champagne and Fromage, and that was actually the sort of epicenter for a lot of protests. People were like, yuppies out, because of the name Champagne and Fromage. The reality is a little bit different to that. Most of the original businesses are still there, and if you actually look, go to the market, it's not all super gentrified, but there is a lot of it. And see that sign there, Honest Burgers. I'm not sure if anybody spends a lot of time in London, but Honest Burgers are one of these sort of street foodie success stories that now got a shop in every high street and have become exactly what they hated. And lots of those started in Brixton Village. What's really interesting though about it really isn't that, because they're not the causes of gentrification, they're symptoms of gentrification, right? But what's really interesting about it is this. So basically, if you own a house in Brixton, you love Brixton Village because it's been estimated to have added £1 billion to local land values. If you don't own a house in Brixton, it's a disaster. And this is the Financial Times. Regeneration schemes have transformed the South London suburb with prices up 30% in 5 years. And I want to point out this, where shoppers can now buy such exotic foods as snail raclette. I don't know what snail raclette is. But the lesson is, there's two lessons. One, so like I said, like all the original businesses are still there, but the big mistake with this was that space makers, because they didn't know what they were doing at the time, and I wouldn't have done any different, they didn't put any asset lock in. So the owners, the landlords, benefited from all these amazing new uses, all these amazing cool businesses, and now because they're landlords and there's nothing to stop them, they will put the prices up, they will put the rents up, because it's cool, it's really cool. They've just sold it, this one enormous, I think Allied Properties have now just sold it to another enormous landlord. So it just becomes this commodity to be traded. And it was so on its arse that if we'd have known, space makers could have said, we'll do this, we want the keys free to all these properties, but you have to give us 50% of the market, or you have to give us at least 25% of the market, which we could then distribute 1% to each of the stallholders so they have some control over its future. Ownership. So I think that's lesson 3, is get a share in the building. Make sure that you benefit and the people around you benefit from when it's successful. So Cricklewood Town Square was the first project I did with Spacemaker, so this was 2013 after I moved to London. And Cricklewood was this weird little scruffy community on the edge of 3 London boroughs. And everyone obviously in the north of England thinks that London is paved with gold, and that we all live burning £5 notes for our heat. But actually there's a lot of really knackered, derelict, gross bits too. And because it's on the edge of 3 boroughs, there's no public space, there's no library, there's no square, there's not even a bench in this community. So all there is just these sort of bits of wasteland. And oddly enough, I moved to London because I met a girl who lived in Cricklewood. So I was suddenly in this community that I was regenerating, which was really weird. And space makers were asked to address this and to do some sort of site activation project that could look at, initially it was like, can you take over one of these empty shops and make something happen like you did in Brixton Village? Because that's all we got for the first 4 years. And after Brixton, after learning that lesson about the gentrification, we tried to do lots of projects that didn't do that and tried to oppose that. So instead said, no, we're not going to do that. This place has a problem with public space. So what we want to do is something about public space. And we proposed a mobile town square that could occupy different bits of wasteland and turn those wastelands into public space and prove to the boroughs, the 3 boroughs, that public space is necessary and desired and would be used in this community. This was designed by a designer called Kieran Jones, and it's actually like it's sort of antithetical to how I like design to be. It's sort of pastiche, which I'm now getting into much more. But it's about doing the right thing for the community, and it really worked. So this is it on that. So this is the scrap of grass outside the big B&Q. That's as good as it gets in Cricklewood in terms of public space. And the Mobile Town Square moved around this community for 6 weeks, spent a week in each site that we identified, including sort of the little town square, a little tiny bit of pavement outside the Costa and the bit outside the bingo hall. And we activated it with a series of events. So the first weekend was a dog show. And obviously, like, dog shows aren't cool. That's not a cool thing to do. It was amazing. We got like 200 people there, and suddenly this green space that was really a problem and had this problem of street drinking, that all the problems evaporated because people were there and people were using it, and it was really, really lovely. And the dog show was called Crickle Woof. And you know, it worked. We had a ceilidh in the space outside Costa. There's a big Irish population in Cricklewood. We had a film screening on top of this weird old car park in the place. And these projects were really, really busy. These events were really, really busy and proved our point. It did actually move around. You could actually cycle it around. It was quite terrifying. And it did actually get graffitied as well. So that's not us being edgy. That actually happened to it. And we had to paint it off. But what's really interesting about Cricklewood is that I think that this project was a failure. I don't think it worked really at all. It proved our point. It proved that we wanted public space and that people would use public space if it was there. But it was a very small part of a massive £1.6 million regeneration project in Cricklewood. And at the time, the orthodoxy in regeneration was we'll put some nice shop fronts on the shops to make it look like it did in Victorian times. And we'll spend lots of money on pavement, and then that will somehow make this place better. And it didn't address any of the failings. Because we did our project at the same time as all this other money was being spunked, if we'd have done it first, we could have proven the need, and then hopefully they could have built a public square after that. But they didn't. And so now, if you look at Cricklewood, you can't see that 1.6 million at all. It's gone. And at the time, we were offered this building. This is a little ex-station house next to Cricklewood Station. And it's currently being used as an architectural salvage scrapyard. And we were offered the building. We were like, no, we've got a much better idea. Always take the building. Always take the building. If we'd have taken that building and we could have opened a not-for-profit cafe in there, a community cafe, or a space for people to work, or a creche, but we would have had an asset, and that asset would have been really easy to pass on to the community. Always take the building. Pop-up is not enough. The next project, so then this is a very much more recent project, and I think we've started to learn all the lessons now. I'm really, really proud of this one. This is Willstone Youth Workshop. And Willstone is another really scruffy community on the edge of London. It's getting a shiny new square. It's getting another massive regeneration project. They're going to knock down this horrendous 80s building, and we're going to recite the town hall there, and they're going to build lots of housing, and the housing will probably be built by a volume house builder, so it'll probably be quite bad. They again asked us to come in and do some sort of site activation project based on Cricklewood this time. And site activation is code for sort of some farmers markets and some nice events and some tea dances, and to try out these sort of different uses of this square, because they were getting a new square as part of this development. But we couldn't find any community to get involved in the project, because there just didn't seem to be much of community feeling there. There weren't any community groups that we could really work with. But also we found out a much wider, much more pressing issue in the area, which was youth. So there's a lot of knife crime, there's a lot of drug selling on the high streets, and lots of the young people feel, either they're involved in it or they feel very frightened about it and feel very disconnected to their community. And the community views young people as a problem. Uniformly, it views them as a problem. So we thought, is there a way we can get some young people in to work in this context and to give them a stake in this regeneration that's going to happen and redirect some of the money to them? So we decided to come up with a thing called Willstone Youth Workshop, where we would commission a designer to work with a group of young people in the area to design and make furniture for the new square. The designer's called Silo. They're amazing, and they basically took 6 young people, these young people, through who were recruited through Open Call, through a process of sort of, I think, 6 or 8 workshops where they learn all the history of design, all these different processes that they could do, and they collectively worked with Silo to home in on producing this thing, which is the Willstone leg, which is this sort of multi-use bracket that can be a shelf bracket, it can be a stool, it can be a chair, it can be a bench, and you can make it yourself. You can buy one to use yourself. The youth were paid a stipend of £500 to be involved in the project, and they received a royalty on each of the legs that were sold. So 50 of the pieces of furniture remained in the community to be used in this square, and the rest was sold. And it got in lots of press. It got in D-Zine, it got in Designo, I don't know how you pronounce that. It got in architecture magazines. It sort of, the youth got paid, they got royalties, they had this amazing experience, and they had this experience of this design community that they would not have ever accessed in Willstone, in their part of London, in their uncool part of London. And as far as these projects go, I think it's a really good bit of public design, public art, public engagement, but I still think that it's not enough. It's not going to change the reality of big developers doing bad quality, overpriced housing blocks in their area. It doesn't stop the march of London house prices. It doesn't address the housing crisis, and it doesn't reopen the youth clubs that are all closing in the area anyway. And it doesn't address the root problems that the machine causes. And I think, so Spacemakers today is run by myself and this guy, Matt Weston, and I think we've realised now that this way of doing it, of responding to briefs that are carved out of bigger regeneration projects, is you're going to get. This is the best it's going to get. And these six young people have had a great experience, and hopefully it will have helped them in their life. But you're never going to achieve what you want to achieve through the system in that way, I don't think. And so we had this is them assembling them in public with these public assembly workshops in the town square. So the final lesson really is build your own machine, by which I mean that you need your own economies, you need your own infrastructure if you want to make your ideas happen. And what I wanted to do just quickly was just to talk about, I think the crucial thing is that the work I was doing about cities, I haven't achieved this yet, and I want to achieve this, but I haven't. So I just wanted to show you some of my heroes who have done it and who are doing it. So Company Drinks is by Catherine Baum, who is amazing, and she basically, how are we doing for time? 5 minutes, perfect. So Catherine is amazing. She basically, Company Drinks is an art project in the shape of a drinks company. It links this amazing history of, in East London, all these all these in the 20th century, women would go down and have these working holidays in the hop picking fields in Kent to pick the hops, pick all the fruit, and they'd live in the fields while they're doing that for 6 weeks at a time. So this amazing culture, for 100 years this happened. Pardon me, shouldn't burp into a microphone. Real one of microphones. So for 100 years, they all went to they built this amazing culture up of resilience and this sort of feminist production culture. And they all went out to these fields every year. And now, of course, that's all gone. So Catherine wanted to relink that history with the people who are living in East London today. And so she set up this thing where they would go back on picking walks and foraging walks and harvest the fruit and the leftover fruit and the blackberries that are in the area, and start to produce a new product out of it, start to produce all these drinks out of it. So basically you go on these amazing coach trips where there are old cockneys, like in their 70s and 80s and 90s, singing Knees Up Mother Brown, and they are with all the new families in Barking today who are from all over the world, and they are united by the fact that they're doing this picking, and it's intergenerational and intercommunity, and all those words are obviously buzzwords, but it is beautiful, this beautiful community that she's built up around this project. And then they sell the drinks, and they're actually making money. And so they sell the drinks for £1 in Barking and £3 in West London, where it's people can afford it, because Barking is very poor. And the money that they make, and they don't actually, Catherine's at pains to point out that she needs funding, because she deserves funding, because she's doing all this amazing social work for these people. But the money that they make helps them, that they reinvest it into their community, into their project, and it gives them independence. RUS are the Rural and Urban Synthesis Society, and they've set up a community land trust. I haven't got time to go into community land trust now, mainly because I don't understand what they are. But they are basically a way of you purchasing land from the public authorities to build something which will then remain in the community as an asset, so it won't be sold on for profit. And basically these people couldn't afford houses in London, and inspired by their parents' generation who built their own houses, and this is a particular architect called Walter Siegel in Lewisham, some of the kids who grew up in these houses then can't afford their own houses, came together with other people from the community to set up this community land trust to build their own housing. And they've got, I'll just talk very briefly about it, but they got some really marginal land, which you can see around them, from Lewisham Borough Council, and they've set up the community land trust so that it's a not-for-profit way of developing this land for a mix of socially rented and owned homes. And then if you want to own them, when you sell them, you have to, a percentage of it goes back into the community. And there's some sort of asset lock where you can't sell it for 2 years, but it's really complicated, and that's why it's really difficult to explain. I don't really understand it yet, but that's what they're going to build. And then finally Granby 4 Streets, and these were rows of, so in Liverpool before the crash, the orthodoxy was no one wants to live in these beautiful terrace houses because they're all empty and they're all selling for like 10 grand. It's a disaster. Let's knock them all down and build really awful flats. And the council did a compulsory purchase order and bought loads of swathes of these terraces for very, very cheap prices. And then, of course, the crash happened. So you had lots and lots and lots of empty homes, lots and lots of homes that had already been demolished. And yet people were still living in and amongst those. So these people basically set up, again, a campaign for a long time to beautify their area with sort of very DIY, bottom-up interventions, like the planting, like street markets, but also eventually hit on the idea of community land trust. And finally, the council managed to convince the council, and the council sold the remaining empty properties to the community land trust. And they then worked with Assemble architects to create new terrace housing inside them. And again, I don't understand the economics of it, I'll be honest. But the housing is the most beautiful terraced housing in the country. And they have just opened a winter garden in some of the abandoned terraces. And I think this is a really interesting thing for me because this is a very go idea. This is the sort of idea we had, not obviously that only we had it, but we were talking about, we used our fanzine to have these sort of ideas and to spread them. But they've done it. And the reason that they've done it is because they have this alternative power structure and the ownership of the infrastructure to make something else possible. And finally, I just want to talk about the project I am doing now, which Heather mentioned earlier, which is the clearing. And this basically is the project we did at Compton Verney. So a lot of my work over the last 4 years now has been about how to survive and thrive in the miserable world we're creating for our children. So I got bored to death of talking about cities and was trying to find a way to talk about climate change for ages. I won't go into how this happened, but basically this is a collaboration with another amazing artist. I'm very lucky to collaborate with amazing artists called Alex Hartley. And we built a physical place where people could come and live in the collapsing world that's coming our way and learn how to live in that world. I programmed it, so we basically built it together with lots of volunteers, which was easily the best 2 weeks of my life. And I programmed, and John Cannon did the identity for it, which is this amazing thing that can work online and offline. He's there today. I'd recommend you work with him if you need any graphic design assistance. But I also programmed a series of workshops where people could come and learn how to do all the skills you'll need when Big Sainsbury's is on fire and the floodwaters are around our ankles. And so this is like how to build fires, this is how to catch rabbits, this is how to make wind turbines. The workshops went up through the levels of technology and sort of progress as the year went on. It was there for a whole year, and this was about how to restart democracy on the 5th of November, hence the bonfire. And then the other part of this that's important to say is that we had a series of caretakers to come and live in the structure to chop the wood and feed the chickens and keep the vision alive and make it feel like a real living thing rather than just someone with a gallery clicker. And the reason I'm telling you about this, just to finish it off with, is there is a quote at the back of a book by a guy called Gavin Wade, who runs Eastside Projects in Birmingham, which is my favourite gallery. And this book is a conversation with him and this other guy called Andy Field. And basically, this particular part of the book. And in that conversation, he says that the problem with art these days is that capitalism is so clever that it's everything that you could imagine as a sort of alternative to the current world has already been imagined and has been commodified. I'm paraphrasing. The idea was I was going to read it to you, but I didn't bring the book, so I can't do that. But the key thing he says is, in the Tate modern today, you can talk all you like about different ways of living, but there's no place to start living it. There's no way to start living it. And I think that's, coming back to the sort of wider theme of city of ideas, I think that's a really interesting thing. What we're trying to do with the clearing is give people a chance to live in a different way in this future. And I think that if you're talking about how organisations like Site and the Millennium Galleries and the cultural organisations in Sheffield can do this thing of inculcate a city of ideas, you basically need to give people a chance to actually do it. And rather than just talking about it, and rather than just saying, like, wouldn't it be great if you put all of the marketing budget or the engagement budget into that scrap of grass that's next to the Howard and has been next to the Howard for a decade and is a bit of grass in the middle, the beating middle of the 5th biggest city in the country, that should not be a bit of grass, guys. This is an important city, an important subculture that should be buildings. I mean, I'm out on a limb. But if you can put that money into that space and actually have people, whether it's artists living there or artists working there, or whether it's space for refugee families or whatever it's space for, whatever you want it to be space for, that is a better way of doing it than talking, I think. So yeah, that is the end.
Hello. I think what I found most interesting about your talk was this sort of critical reflection on failure. And I think failure is a word that's completely outside the rhetoric of kind of urban regeneration projects where everything's sold as a utopia, rather than saying this is the best that we could do with the kind of conditions that we're given. And so I guess my question to you is kind of, how would you sort of reflect back to the kind of planners and architects in the room? What are your kind of demands or kind of lessons, I suppose, from your experiences?
My demands, wow. Thank you finally for asking me what my demands are. Guys, it's been 10 years. You just had to ask. I think that what you said then about, that's a really good question, and what you said about how did you start it? Like the reality of what we can do.
I suppose it's like everything's sold as a utopia, but actually what we should be saying is like, this is what we could do with the conditions we were given.
So I think that was, when we started doing the work we were doing in Sheffield, what we can do with the conditions we were giving was what the council, that was their response. Like, they were terrified of anything big after what they perceived as failures of like the World Student Games, which is understandable. But also it's that sort of pragmatic, this is as good as it's going to get, guys, sort of thing. And I think that the one thing it's always been so frustrating for me is that Sheffield has the best architecture department in the country. They're just there, they're up there, and they're making all this amazing work, all these amazing models, and yet you look at the stuff that's been built at the back of the moor, and it's shameful, right? And so it's like, how do you connect those two things? How can you? Fiona showed that beautiful image of, in Milton Keynes, the sort of temporary utopia station, and that sort of thing. That sort of thing is a really good way of doing it because it shows you what else is possible. But again, it's just the infrastructure to do it. If you could just have some way of saying to the 5 best architecture graduates every year, here's a space, here we need this building, here's a budget of 50 grand, and that's not enough, or 100 grand. I mean, I'm that's pie in the sky, but like committing to that sort of thing will get you out of the situation that you're in. But also, I think just the sort of the very, very simple stuff, like Sheffield prides itself on being the greenest city in the country. Obviously, it cut down all the trees, and that's why it didn't get Channel 4. They moved to Leeds instead. Obviously, that's why it happened, because the PR is so toxic. But if you just said, right, we're going to make the best cyclepaths in the country, and we're going to spend the budget, and I know I'm not an idiot. I know that austerity has happened to Sheffield. Austerity has happened to most places outside of London in this horrible, unfair way, where London is allowed a public transport system and the rest of the country isn't. And I know that has to change too. But if you just put all your attention on one thing, and you could as a city, I know that you is ridiculous, in terms of power structure in the city, you could decide, right, we're going to have the best psychopaths in the country. And then suddenly everyone's talking about that, and Sheffield's like, oh, you know about Sheffield. So I think it's partly like having space to have big ideas, but also just using the talent that's here and just, giving it a little bit of cash, just a little bit.
Cool, thanks.
Yeah, it's kind of leading on from that one. It's from my experience, Sheffield treats its top creatives pretty terribly, as in the experiences you found with you were doing such amazing stuff at one point, and then by the council and kind of local authorities and the kind of groups, like nationally it was understood and applauded, but locally there's a kind of consensus perhaps against genuine or things with genuine creative merit. And I've found a pattern where there's graduate retention, say for example from the School of Architecture or other schools, and then they're treated so badly by the system in Sheffield, get the worst kind of jobs, that they just leave, within the year, because they're like, wow, this is so bad. I've also found that in terms of articulating that to the council, it's impossibly hard, because you can't even articulate the value of creativity, because many of them don't even have the vision, or they don't even see what the potential is. I'm not sure whether that's kind of egotism or self-deprecation, but I would just like to hear a little bit from you about the kind of social landscape with your experience of Sheffield, and how we might actually crack that and make some headway in this area, because it seems like a bit of a dead end at the moment.
That's a really good question. And actually, I think the thing that I've learned, and that's going back to your question, Cecily, is that we didn't make it easy for Sheffield City Council to like us. And particularly now with austerity, but even at the time, we were pretty, we were too arrogant. And actually, it would have been much better to have made a vehicle for, I think that's the key thing. It's like having a vehicle that the council can do business with, right? They can understand. So if it's two guys doing a fanzine and using swear words in the fanzine, then I think that's going to be quite easy for them to dismiss. But if it is a community land trust that's saying, right, this that site at the end of this street here, Sydney Street, opposite block, where it's been like a wasteland for 10 years. I'm not sure if it's still a wasteland. It might not be a wasteland now. And I think it's really important for me to say that I don't know Sheffield anymore, right? I know Sheffield in my head 10 years ago. But if you're a community land trust and you say, or like you guys with the food hall, if you can say, right, actually Polpo and these 4 other organisations support us, and we're going to, and it's a lot easier to say in theory than in practice, because it takes a lot of, you've already put loads and loads of time and blood and sweat and tears into what you're doing. But if you can say we are a community land trust and we are the sort of independent Sheffield cultural providers or whatever, however you want to badge it, I think that will, in my experience, that's what I would have done differently, if that makes sense. I think that the projects that I've shown are semi-official, and they're presenting themselves as official. And what we presented ourselves as a fait accompli, and we were like, this idea is great, guys, support it. But if we'd have said, this is the Cooling Towers Investment Company, and you can buy a share of it, right? Or everyone in this room can buy a share for £5. And if we'd have sold those shares, and if we'd have sold 2,000 of those shares, and that's 10 grand, and suddenly you can say, look, we've raised 10 grand already. I think that it's that sort of language that people in municipal power will understand in a different way. If that makes sense. Yeah. But that's the great thing for me about what Heather was saying. It was like, and I'd not really thought about it in such blunt terms, but you just lie. You keep your terms to yourself, and you say, yes, we're going to do these for this is how we meet your engagement strategy. And then once they give you the money, you say, this is what we're doing. And as long as it doesn't upset them too much, then that's what you do, I think. Cool. Thank you very much.